Welcome to our next discipleship class. So today, what we're going to go through is a presentation on morals and the issue of morality and how morality fits into the scheme of theology. In other words, do we actually need God to exist in order for morality to exist? Now, I know there's a lot of Christians out there that talk about an aspect of morality even though God doesn't exist. I would personally disagree with that. I'll show you why in this presentation. I believe that logically and obviously philosophically and everything, God is necessary in order for morality to be there. So I've entitled this, Morality Requires God. No God, that equals no morality. So as we move forward here, I hope to make the case cleaner. So this is the outline that we will follow. What is truth? We'll talk about that. Then we'll also go through, obviously, what is morality. And we'll follow on with how do we know morality? We will get to no God equals no morality. And then God equals the answer to morality. And then finally we'll go over a summary. So we'll see if we can do this in one video, see how long it takes. So what is truth? Truth matches its object. We're dealing with the facts here. So truth tells it like it is. In other words, it claims the obvious. Truth corresponds. We're dealing with the correspondent view of truth. Truth corresponds to reality. Reality doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction. We'll see this in a moment. So as a reminder, the law of non-contradiction is you can't have two things that are opposite and true at the same time in the same sense. So for example, truth matches or corresponds to reality. It matches its object, right? Corresponds to reality. I have a control in my right hand. I'm making a truth claim that can actually be checked out and verified. That's reality. I have a control in my right hand. I actually don't. So that's a claim that may be made, but it's not true. So truth isn't tricky. We can know what truth is. So what is false does not match or correspond to reality, what is real. For example, right, this object is a book. Now I know it's just a picture of a book, but you understand the example, which is a great book, by the way, Legislating Morality by Dr. Frank Turk and Dr. Norman Geisler. I would recommend it if you want to learn about that. But the claim matches its object. That is dealing with reality. We're not in the Twilight Zone. We're not in fantasy land. We're dealing with what is real. So the truth is knowable because of that, because we can know what reality is. It is self-evident. There are those that believe we're living in an illusion. It is logically contradictory. You cannot be in an illusion and know you're in an illusion. You have to actually get outside of the illusion to know it's an illusion. And unfortunately, people seem to struggle with that very simple concept. You know you have a dream when you what? When you wake up from the dream. When you're dreaming, you don't know that it's a dream. Seems very, very real. So illusions are the same way. If you're in an illusion, you don't know it's an illusion. That's the whole point. So people that are claiming we're living in an illusion, apparently the truth is eluding them, if you will. Therefore, because the truth is knowable, therefore reality is knowable. We can know what reality is. The truth is absolute because reality is absolute, right? To deny this is to affirm this. You cannot deny, because you're using the law of non-contradiction, you can't deny that the truth is absolute, because in doing that, you'll be making absolute truth claims. We'll get into that as examples. So absolutes are undeniable, right? I am absolutely sure there are no absolutes. So we have these little funny cartoons, right? You should never say never. Obviously, they make the point that absolutes are undeniable. Even when you try to deny an absolute, you are using non-contradiction and the absolute nature of truth in order to do that. And if you want to get more detail on this, you can look up my apologetics video, number 1 and 2, on the truth is knowable and the opposite of true is false. So there is no absolute truth. What would the response be? Dr. Frank Turek and Norman Geisler call this the Roadrunner tactic, right? Isn't that an absolute truth claim? So obviously, you're turning the claim around. Will the claim be able to sustain its own principle, right? To make a claim there is no absolute truth, well, that's an absolute truth claim, so it fails. All truth is relative. So what would be the response to that, right? Isn't that relative? Is that truth relative? No, it's not. That's an absolute truth claim. The absolute truth claim is that all truth is relative, right? So it's in violation of its own principle, and it also violates the law of non-contradiction, right? Because it is claiming that something opposite of it is different, right, than what it is. So the law of non-contradiction is unavoidable. It is affirmed when denied. Truth is absolute, which is undeniable. So when I deal with the law of non-contradiction, I am making a claim. If I'm some professor in a classroom and I say all truth is relative, sounds very heady, sounds educational, sounds intellectual. It's wrong. You couldn't defend that, no matter what kind of fancy words or sentences you put around it, because making an absolute truth claim to say that there are no absolute truths, it falls down. It falls on its own sword. So the law of non-contradiction would show you that the opposite of that claim, right, does not match the claim that it's making, and that's how you would see its failure. So here we have C.S. Lewis. We can't know what is unjust unless we know what is just. So this is a quote from Mere Christianity. He says, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line, right? So you need something absolute to measure from. You can't have a relative to a relative to a relative. There's no basis. You have to have an absolute. When we built this building, the walls had to be upright. We didn't kind of eyeball them. Though we use lasers in the old days, they use a plumb line. So the plumb line would utilize gravity. You hold it up and it goes down, and then what absolute vertical is, and then you can put the wall up. It's straight, and then you make each wall meet it accordingly. But if you don't know what straight is, you can't tell how far off. You couldn't tell how far off the exact vertical a wall was if you didn't use a plumb line or really a laser at this point in history to be able to do that. So there's no way to know what anything is. You can't even learn anything without absolutes. The truth has to be knowable. Now, people talk philosophically about this and they argue back and forth, but the reality is nobody lives like that. Nobody deals with a relative aspect of truth. This is true for you, but not for me. Nobody goes to the bank and says, hey, give me $10 out of my account, and they say, we're sorry, you only have 50 cents. Hey, I just put $100 in yesterday. Well, that's true for you, but not for me. Nobody lives like that. They just argue philosophies like that, but even the philosophies have to be reasonable and make sense and follow a logical order. True progress or regress demands an absolute standard. We live in a universe of absolutes, right? We can't know the world is getting better or worse unless we know what is best. You have to know where you're going, otherwise you don't know how to get there. If this is best, I can then figure out how far off of best I am, right? And we do know a world with less hate, bigotry, and intolerance is a better one. The question is why we know this is, right? Why we know this is the actual question, and that's what the issue is going to be as we walk through this presentation and we go further. So even relativists, people that believe in relativism, they have absolutes, right? When they claim truth is relative, they're claiming the opposite of their claim is absolutely true. So they violate non-contradiction. When they claim right and wrong are subjective, in other words, just to me, my own bias, right? Objective is towards the object. That's the focus. Subjective is towards the subject, me, right? When they claim right and wrong are subjective, just, my own little world here, and not objective, their claim subjectively declares that the objective opposite of their claim to be absolutely true. Again, they're using, though they're denying non-contradiction, they have to use it in order to even make their claim, though it is an incorrect claim. When they claim non-contradiction to be false, when they say, well, you don't have to live by the law of non-contradiction, they use non-contradiction to claim the opposite is false and their view true. They're actually using non-contradiction to try to dispel that as being true, right? So it affirms absolute truth, claiming it false. So as they claim the opposite of their view is false, they're using the law of non-contradiction. Now, that's the irony of the whole thing. So, as we move on, number 2, what is morality? So, morality is the obligation of right and wrong behavior. That's what it is. It is an obligation towards it. And under that obligation, we will look at prescription versus description, which people need to distinguish. Ought versus is, imperative versus declaration. And then secondly, morality is not the preference, opinion of right and wrong behavior. In other words, morality is an obligation to do what's right and wrong. It's not a preference or an opinion as to what is right and wrong, okay? Behavior. And we'll look under that at subjectivity and preference, and we'll also look at objectivity and demand. And so we'll view these, and hopefully this will begin to clear up some of the confusion. So first of all, prescription versus description. Morality is prescriptive, not descriptive. Morality prescribes one behavior right and the other wrong. This is prescriptive, what people ought to do. So you go to the doctor, you're not feeling well, they prescribe medication. That is what you ought to take, okay? This has no relation to just describing what people do. Observation describes what people do. Well, 51% of the people take this medication that have that problem. That's description, but that's not prescription. This is descriptive, what people do. Morality prescribes a behavior. Sociology describes a behavior. Sociologists look and they say, wow, looks like the majority of the people do this. Well, they're just describing, if it's in the realm of morality, so if 60% of the people do this, then the conclusion that sociologists reach is, well, that must be the current norm and that's okay to do. Well, it may not be okay to do. Just because you're observing and describing what people do, that has nothing to do with what morality is. You may be watching what they do, but that's not morality. That's just sociology. That is describing their behavior, but it is not prescribing what they ought to do or not ought to do. There is no obligation in following what people do, only in what people ought to do. Very, very simple. How about ought versus is, right? Ought is prescriptive, is descriptive, right? There is no obligation in what is. That's just what people are doing. It's what is, right? What is simply describes things as they are. There is obligation in what ought to be. That's different. What ought to be done carries the obligation to obey. In other words, to do what is right. Morality, apart from obligation, is not morality. It's not morality at all, right? When there is no obligation to a certain behavior, there's simply preference or opinion. It's maybe what I would like to see done or what I think should be done, but there is no way to obligate to it, and it isn't morality unless it's an obligation. How about imperative versus declaration? Imperative is a command, obligation to obey, right? Commands require compliance by an external obligating authority. We don't command ourselves. I don't give myself orders. I don't obligate myself. Now, yes, I feel a conviction to certain things. Everybody does. That's not what I'm talking about. In other words, I don't have the position over myself where I am obligating from a higher authority and demanding anything. Declarations are announcements, proclamations of what is. This is what people do, right? Announcements are informational. They are describing things. We are informed as to what is under a declaration. Morality is not a preference. This is so important. Morality is not a preference of right and wrong behavior. Subjectivity and preference, right? Here's an example. Animals have no moral obligation. They prefer one animal for lunch over another and exercise that preference, right? There's no sense of right and wrong. It is within the nature of carnivorous animals to eat other animals. It is natural and expected. Nobody looks at it as wrong. That preference is subject to them. If the lion wants to hunt down the gazelle because they want a snack, then that's what they do. An animal's preference is subject to them alone, right? There is no objective moral right and wrong in the behavior to eat other animals for lunch. It's very simple, right? How about objectivity and demand, which is different? People have a moral obligation. In other words, it is wrong for people to eat other people. People know this is wrong by an innate sense first. Nobody on the planet, unless they're just there's some damage to their thinking, but even people that are, the Jeffrey Dahmers and all that, they knew what they were doing was wrong. Okay, they did it, to hide and everything else. But just because they wanted to do it doesn't mean they didn't know it was wrong. They had an innate sense that it was wrong, but they did it anyways. And laws are made to prevent this behavior. That's the second thing. So everybody has the innate sense that it's wrong to eat everybody else. And then so they create laws to prevent that and to try to legislate people's behavior. Now, why do people have this sense? This is the big question. Either it comes from themselves, right? It's subjective. This then is only opinion. In other words, there's no obligation. If I evolved and developed this sense as I evolved that I should not eat other people, and it came from me, then it is subject to me, and it carries no obligation for anybody else. That's just from me alone, if that's how it arrived. Or I may get this sense from outside of me. It may transcend humanity, right? And that would mean that it is objective because it is now imposed on everybody from an outside or transcendent referent. This then is an obligation from a higher authority, and it requires compliance because it's an authority that is beyond us that is giving this command to each of us. So, important note about morality at this point. Morality is an obligation to, first of all people in all places, all the times. So, at all times, everywhere and every place, this is what people are obligated to. That's what morality is. Preference or opinion is for some people in some places at some times. And so that's different, right? Morality is like truth in the absolute sense. Truth is absolute because it is the same for all people in all places at all times. In other words, gravity, it's the same here as it is on the other side of the world. You step off of a building and you're going to hit the ground. Math is the same for everybody. 2 plus 2 here is the exact same as 2 plus 2 every place else in the world. 2 plus 2 isn't 5 anywhere. Varying opinions is true for some people in some places at some times. So people can have varied opinions, and that can change by the person or the location. That's fine. In other words, countries have different laws and practices relative to other countries that they prefer. You go to some countries, one thing is legal in one country, it's illegal in another country. They have that choice. Those are preferences, and laws are made to match that. This does not obligate all countries to the same preferences, okay? So, morality is not a preference. The demand is not related to another person, but the moral obligation is imposed on them from a higher authority. That's what morality is. It is a demand. If there were no laws against eating other people, in our animals and people example, there would be no violation regardless of the preference or opinion of the eater or the eaten. So think about that. If there were no laws against eating other people, then you can't violate the law. If you decide to, if one person said, hey, I'm going to go eat another person for lunch, well, though we may not like it, it may not be our preference or opinion, they're not violating any laws, regardless of the person doing the eating or the one getting eaten. Either way. Now, the only way for there to be an obligation against eating others is for a high authority imposing that behavior to be wrong, in other words, immoral. If there's some reference point, some overriding authority beyond all people that say eating other people is wrong, then it is immoral. It's immoral to eat other people. In other words, that's what makes it wrong, regardless of what people's preferences are. Everyone has a sense of what is right and wrong. This is universal among humanity. The question at this point isn't what is right and wrong behavior. The question is why everyone has a sense of right and wrong behavior universally. So we're going to look at an example. Now again, I said this is the real question. This is the issue behind morality. Why does everybody have that sense? So here's an example to try to bring this home. Assuming no government existing to make or enforce laws, there would be no existing laws to violate. So if we lived in a situation, there's no government. There's just people living, okay? So there's no laws on any books. If a person put up a stop sign in their neighborhood, the cars would stop at intersections so children could safely play. Does the sign represent a command or a preference? Now, so here's the situation. We're living in this neighborhood. There's no government. We see people going fast through the neighborhood. I live on a corner, and I notice that, hey, this is going to be dangerous for, kids in the neighborhood. So what do? We put up a sign that says stop. We figure if the cars stop at the intersection, it'll be safer for everybody, okay? But is that a command to the people driving, or is it a preference? Here's the answer. It's a preference, since there is no authority to impose a right and wrong behavior whether cars stop or don't stop. There's nobody other than the people that put up the stop sign that says, I would prefer that you stop, but if they don't stop, there's nothing you can do. It's not like you can write them a ticket. There is no tickets. There's no government to write the tickets for, because there's no law that's being violated. Citizens can yell, fight, demand money, fines, right, against those who don't stop, but there is no obligation for cars to stop other than the preference of those in the neighborhood. So do you follow the example? I want you to think about it, right? So as we move on, even if people in the neighborhood band together and agree that all cars should stop at the stop sign, not stopping does not make drivers violators or wrong, since it is only an agreement to a preference and not an obligation from a higher authority able to impose objective commands based on laws. I know that's a mouthful, but basically, if even if everybody in the neighborhood wanted people to stop at that stop sign and were angry that they didn't, they're still not violating any laws. There's no laws to violate. It's still a preference because nobody is obligating beyond the people in the neighborhood. You follow? Now, if the neighborhood community bands together to create a government, let's make one, and write a law to stop at the stop sign, it then becomes a violation and the behavior considered wrong since stopping is right. This is legislating morality. So basically the citizens get together, they say, hey, we're going to create a government, and so we create this government, we make this law that you have to stop at the stop sign, otherwise you're in violation of the law. So what does that mean? That means stopping is right, not stopping and running the stop sign is wrong, and you can end up paying a fine. One behavior is acceptable, which is obeying the law and stopping at the sign. The other is unacceptable. It is a violation. However, it is only the preference of the same community of people who wanted it to be wrong, not to stop. Therefore, if the government officials change the law to be opposite, has the moral truth changed? In other words, is truth relative? So we're in this situation, we're going for a while, and then all of a sudden, the government officials say, hey, you know what? This is slowing down traffic, and we've seen more car accidents than than some of the dangers in the neighborhood. So we're going to say we don't want people stopping at the stop signs anymore. And now the law is you have to not stop at the stop sign, but drive right through the intersection because the majority decided to vote that way. The question is, did the truth change, right? Has the moral truth changed? No. The preference of the majority changed, right? The truth has not changed. Only what is preferred to be legally accepted. You don't establish truth by majority vote. That you can have 99%, you can have 100% of the people in the world say that 2 + 2 is 5. It's never going to be 5. You can't change the absolute truth and the nature of truth by voting, by desire, by preference, by opinion. It doesn't matter. That'll never change the truth. The truth is fixed. You can have everybody vote that gravity doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't make it go away. You can have people not believe in gravity. They don't float away. Okay? You don't have to believe in gravity in order to stay on the ground. It is a law that has been established, and it's a physical law that isn't going to change. 2 + 2 is always going to be 4. It's not going to change. It's not going to change in some alternate universe that doesn't exist. It's never going to change. It's always going to be the same. So halfway through this little last paragraph, it says, the truth remains absolute, which is the law must be observed. You see, that's the truth. The truth is that the law needs to be observed. When there's a law, there's an obligation to obey it. The value expressed in the law is the same, safety. The first value was that, hey, we want to protect the kids in the neighborhood. Now we're finding people dying in traffic accidents from too many stops, so we're going to have them not stop anymore, right? And the truth did not change, which is the law obligates a particular behavior. All laws obligate behavior. That's where they come from, not opinions. Opinions don't obligate anything. They're just preferences. The question is, why is the truth that the law must be observed, even when made by a governing people, considered the right behavior to follow? Because the moral imperative exists within every human, which is ontological, not epistemological. Okay, what do we mean by that? Ontology is the study of the nature of being. In other words, why does something exist? Where does it come from? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. In other words, like, how do we know what we know? Why do we even know that, right? So I can know things about things epistemologically and not necessarily know why they exist or where they came from. So, but those two studies, the study of the nature of being and the study of knowledge, they need to be distinguished, especially in dealing with morality. Right and wrong are absolutes that correlates to the absolute nature of truth. To argue they are relative uses the framework of absolutes, we talked about this non-contradiction, regarding right and wrong, to claim an absolute position wrong. They're claiming the opposite of their position is wrong. They're using non-contradiction. You can never escape this. The law of non-contradiction exposes the absolute nature of truth. In other words, the opposite of true is false. It's always going to be like that. Or at least I'm saying the opposite of my statement, my claim is false. Claims against non-contradiction cannot be made without affirming non-contradiction, since it is used to make the claim. We've talked about that. Why does non-contradiction make reasonable sense and factually apply to everyday life? Because it exists ontologically in man's thinking before evaluating what he knows epistemologically to be true. So we talked about that, the bank example, or, you're racing down the road, you get pulled over by a policeman, he says, hey, you're going 80 and a 30. And what are you going to say? That may be true for you, but not for me. He's going to give you a ticket anyways. All right. So the reason non-contradiction makes sense logically, it's how we think normally, it's reasonable, it's philosophically solid and everything else. The reason is because it comes from outside. In other words, that's how I am designed to think. That's why everybody thinks like that, which means that the ontological question is, where does it come from? It can't come from me. Otherwise, my thinking and my world would be different than 7+ billion other people. We'd all have our own reality. That's ridiculous. Nobody believes that. Nobody functions like that. Nobody makes laws like that. And people that try to argue against it are in conflict with actual reality because they're using non-contradiction to deny it. But in a person's thinking, because it is given to them, then they can then use what they know epistemologically and examine what is true. But it's only because it's given from the outside. Does the sense of right and wrong, morality, develop through biology? In other words, am I hardwired? That's a big question, especially among atheists and evolutionists. No. Why? We have to ask that question. If biology gave rise to a moral sense, it wouldn't be morality. It would be a chemical reaction to stimulus, no different than animals. This is not objective truth expressed in right and wrong behavior. There's no animals out there dealing with morality. They just do, they react, they respond based on their nature. They're hungry, they go get something to eat, really some other animal. None of that's based on morality or objective truth. So if my sense of what I am calling morality just is hardwired, if it's from biology, it's not. You can call it morality, but it's not morality. It's just a response to stimulus. If learned behaviors, there's another option, right? If learned behaviors through any form of development gave rise to a moral sense, it wouldn't be morality. It would be a behavior practiced by guidance. This is not objective truth expressed in right and wrong behavior. In other words, if an animal learns something because they're shown by the parent and they model it or whatever, that's not morality. That is just learned behavior. That's all it is. It's practiced by the guidance of the parent animal or whatever. Look, obviously, a lot of animals have stuff that is hardwired. We know that because, the golden plover babies that fly from, up in the Antarctic, Alaska area down to Hawaii, they leave 2 weeks after the parents, and they know how to get there. And nobody, gave them a map. Nobody gave them a GPS. They've never been there before because they were just born. So, look, this hardwired and this information that they have, this ability, has to be ontologically given from somewhere else. It is not from the ground up, it's from the top down. And if it was from the ground up, if I had this sense of morality because it was just something I learned over time, it wouldn't be morality. It would just be something I was guided to do. I think it's important to understand that difference. Any behavior declared right or wrong based on biology or learned practice confuses is versus ought. That's what I am doing, that's what is, but it's not what I ought to do. There's no oughtness, there's no obligation to it. You need to understand that distinction. What is describes what people do. Again, this is sociology. What people ought to do is prescribed by the one who right and wrong is grounded in. In other words, where is morality grounded? It has to have an absolute grounding beyond all people, beyond humanity. Now, obviously, I'm going to make the case that that is God in his nature. Confusing is and ought confuses what morality is, because it's trying to make morality really what is sociology, just a description of what people do. And that'll never be true. Natural selection of the gaps. That's what I call this. So people that believe that we just evolved, and that's where we get our sense of morality. This is also called begging the question, assuming what you're trying to prove. But I call this the natural selection of the gaps. So this is how it goes. There is no God. This is the position of the atheist and the atheistic evolutionists. I know morality and have a sense of right and wrong. That's what they claim. Therefore, morality comes from biology. Well, that's because there's no other option. That's the only place it can come from. Why can't it come from God? The answer? Because I know morality and don't believe in God. There is no God, right? So this is circular reasoning. They assume what they're trying to prove. So because I don't believe that God exists and I have this sense of morality, then obviously I don't need God. That doesn't logically follow, and we'll see that. So atheists are consistently inconsistent when it comes to dealing with morality. Now, we know there's a universal moral guilt, and that shows in a universal moral law. Everybody feels guilty. Look, if I was making my own conscience and guilt, I wouldn't feel guilty. Why would I feel guilty? But everybody feels guilt because it comes from the transcendent God, not from ourselves. This isn't a development of biology, It is based on the universal moral law that is grounded in God's nature. Again, we'll look at C.S. Lewis making excuses for our faults. He says, it seems then, we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. In other words, if they don't, they feel guilty. Second, they do not in fact behave in that way. The truth is, we believe in decency so much that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it, and consequently, we try to shift responsibility. So we try to shift our responsibility because we feel guilty. That's why. And so, but where does the guilt come from? Again, the ontological issue. It's not coming from biology at all. So these same basic moral codes are found in all major cultures, right? So Lewis, he shows that prohibitions against disrespect of parents, lying, stealing, killing are found in all major cultures of the world. You can read it in his book, The Abolition of Man. So now, number 3, how do we know morality? Everyone knows, right, has an internal sense what is morally right and wrong. Everybody. Doesn't matter who they are. Now, it may not be refined. It can be a little bit skewed, but everybody has it. We know it intuitionally in ourselves, and we know it by our reactions to others. That's how we know it. Knowing morality does not answer where it comes from or why it exists, only its existence, right? So I know it exists. I don't know where it comes from. So my knowing morality does not answer where it comes from, only that it exists, right? Now, there are many things we don't want others to do to us. In other words, right? Lie, cheat, abuse, kill, right? We all find some things evil, right? Genocide, racism, bigotry. We like the golden rule, right? Do unto others what you would have others do to you. That's what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. But we do find certain things universally offensive and wrong. Everybody has that sense, and that's the point here, right? So, differing cultural preferences do not make morals relative. We know that. We know that doing things that are immoral in nature, and we know they're immoral in nature, even if it's done by a different culture, it doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't make the morals or the truth, these absolute morals, relative. Right and wrong aren't relative. That is a subjective preference which can change. So, again, we talked about this. You can go from one country to another. They make laws. Different things are a preference, but there are certain things that are absolute. Morality is dealing with ethics, right? What is right? What is wrong? And morality is absolute. Morals are absolute. They are not relative. They never will be because they don't come from us. For something to be right or wrong, it must have an objective, fixed reference point. And again, I'm arguing that that's God. Moral disputes demand an objective standard outside the dispute. So people that are arguing, oh no, morality's relative. No, it isn't relative, right? How is it solved? The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either of them, and it has to be beyond them. It's not another parallel horizontal standard that's just added into the formula or into the mix. It has to be something outside that is from an external or transcendent reference point that is imposed and has the authority to impose on those that are dealing with the moral issues, right? So moral comparisons demand an objective standard, something. Now, again, atheists, it is said, and it is true, they have no way to justify their morality. And that's true, but I think it goes beyond that. Mother Teresa is better than Hitler. We know that. We know that the world that she was trying to deal with is better than the one that Hitler was trying to deal with. Because anybody that would say, I want to live in Hitler's world, something wrong with that, especially if they were a Jew or any of the other groups that he had targeted. So we know that that's a problem. Everybody does. That's why the world was against him. Okay? Now, distinguishing absolutes versus relatives, right? This is important for us to understand. First of all, values are absolute, but their instances are relative. So we need to make these distinctions. They're very, very important. Values versus understanding. The values, again, are absolute. The relative aspect of them is understanding the values, right? The end is absolute. The means to get to the end is relative. The command is absolute, right? But the culture that it's applied in, that can be relative. It can be different. Again, values are absolute. Which value is relative? We'll look at some examples, all right? So values versus instances, right? These tend to get confused. Absolute moral values do not change, but beliefs about whether a given action violates a moral value do change in a given instance. It depends on what the instance is. For example, witch hunters used to believe witches murdered people with their curses. Now we know they do not. So that was a belief in the past, which is why they killed, I think it was 18 witches. The moral value versus murder did not change. People's understanding of what violated the moral value did change. In other words, murder is wrong, and so they applied the death penalty to the witches because they thought they were murdering people, right? So once they understood that that wasn't true, then they stopped murdering witches, right? They stopped applying the death penalty to them. So murder is wrong, and it's just as the understanding developed, then obviously the execution of people thinking that they were murdering, that changed too. But the value didn't change. The value was murder was always wrong. It's just how they were applying it to certain instances. Values versus understanding. Again, an important distinction. A person's understanding of a moral value can change over time. The moral value itself, however, does not change. The truth of a statement resides in its relation to reality, not in its relation to the individual's judgment about it. So again, we'll see an example, but my understanding of a value does not change the value. It's my understanding that's changing, right? So, for example, a couple understands love better many years, right? However, after many years, love didn't change. Their understanding of it changed. So their love develops over the years, and it changes, but the love didn't change. Their understanding about what love was, and so their relationship develops, right? It's a matter of understanding, right? Because the value is the same. The end versus the means, again, an important distinction. Basic moral end, right? The moral value itself does not change, the goal of where we're going. But the means, how to attain the moral value, that may change, right? So, for example, right, both pacifists and militarists desire the same end, which is peace, right? They simply disagree as to the means to attain that end. Some think you need to achieve it through war. Some think that you need to have a group hug. Look, the end is the same. It's how we get there. That's the relative aspect. How about command versus culture, right? Just because a moral command is expressed differently in different cultures does not mean the moral command itself is different, all right? For example, right? Greeting by a kiss is considered polite in some cultures, in others it would repel, right? What should be done, in other words, the greeting, is the same. How it should be done is different, all right? So the command to greet, yes. How to greet, well, that's going to change. Whether values change versus which values changed. There are many times when the issue is not whether a moral value exists and should be applied, but which moral value should be applied in a given situation. So, for example, a woman contemplating abortion may believe that the human life has value, but she may have been told that an unborn child is not human. So you have this woman, and she says, okay, well, I'm contemplating having an abortion. Why is that? Well, I mean, I would never kill anybody that's human, but I don't believe that the baby's human. Now, so the value is that the respect for human life is there. It's just that they're applying it differently because they're defining the baby in the womb as not being human, which is a whole nother discussion, but obviously just separating a baby from the outside world with some layers of skin does not dehumanize it, okay? So number 3, no God equals no morality. This is where we're going. Without God, there is no place to ground morality outside of human preference. It's kind of a bottom line. Now, atheists understand morality, right? Richard Dawkins understands that without God, there is no moral obligation. Therefore, stop worrying. That was on his bus tour there back in 2008, 2009. Why? Because there is no one to be morally accountable to. The implication is moral restrictions prevents life's enjoyment, right? No God equals no morality. He understands that, and a lot of atheists do. Now, no one human or group can determine the absolute nature of truth. It must be discovered. Now, we talked about it earlier, saying that, you can't vote what is true, okay? It doesn't happen by majority vote, and you don't get a certain number of people that just determine something is true, okay? Truth has to be discovered. Humans don't determine mathematical laws, they discover them. Nobody ever made a mathematical law. Humans don't determine physical laws, they discover them. No human ever made gravity, right? It was discovered. Humans discover existing laws created by a mind. Minds make laws. Laws just don't come from nowhere. Laws don't arise by themselves. Just as physical laws need to be grounded in a mind, moral laws need an external referent mind that transcends humanity. Otherwise, there is no absolute truth, which we know exists by reason, logic, and experience. We know that the truth exists. By our reason, our logic, our experience, we know it does. So obviously, the mind that made them has to be there too. We don't invent the moral law any more than we invent mathematical or physical laws. No one invented the laws of math, and Newton did not invent gravity. Like moral laws, they were discovered. Number 4, God is the answer to morality. There is no morality or any preference or opinion without the existence of God, and I'll show you why. Why? It is often argued that relativistic morality or truth exists without God, but there would be no way to reason the existence of morality, even with relativistic faulty conclusions, unless God exists. In other words, the ability to think and reason, even inaccurately or logically consistent, or really should be logically inconsistent, still requires the existence of an absolute being that transcends humanity, creating the time-space continuum and providing a framework of all discoverable laws, including the sense of right and wrong, within each human. So just the ability to think and reason this stuff out, even if it's done inaccurately, is the point, still requires this absolute being that transcends all of humanity. It still requires God. That's the point. An atheistic universe, which is not possible logically, reasonably, scientifically, or actually, because there's no way to account for it. All right, and this includes Lawrence Krauss's universe from nothing. He would have to account for his quantum vacuum. So that's something. Okay, when we're talking about nothing, we mean no thing. I like Aristotle's definition of nothing. It's what rocks dream about. That's nothing. Doesn't exist. Non-existent. Right? So an atheistic universe could not result in the thinking ability to even evaluate the possibility of such a universe. Thought would not actually be thinking. It would only be random chemicals reaction believed to be thought. That is... Think about that, okay? Try to absorb that statement. Now, entire materialistic means can never do anything other than react to stimuli at best. This also needs a creator to answer the design, complexity, and goal-directedness of all nature. So basically, if we only had a materialistic universe, which is the claim by atheists, then nothing would ever be anything more than just a chemical reaction. Now, we're not even talking about where the chemicals came from, but assuming they were there, right? Now, but this materialistic universe obviously needs a creator because there's no way to account for the design, complexity, and goal-directedness of all nature. Just asserting that a creator does not exist does not make him go away. Not seeing God, as atheists often expect he should show up, has undermined their whole system of thinking. They seem to forget, if he in fact is there, he is not a molecule for them to analyze. He is in fact the reason they live, breathe, think, and argue. Without him, none of these aspects of their lives exist. The problem isn't that they don't see God, it's that they don't really see themselves properly. That's the issue. God isn't interested in swapping places with them, though that is their requirement to acknowledge his existence. So they kind of put God in a position where he's not going to fill, and then say, see, he's not filling it, so I don't believe he's there. Again, we get this quote from C.S. Lewis regarding, can we trust our thinking? He says, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind, in that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. In other words, just kind of got there somehow, right? It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. It wouldn't actually be thought or thinking. We wouldn't be able to trust it, right? Now, trying to remove the need for God, right? In other words, the immaterial, infinitely powerful, infinitely knowing, infinitely perfect, intelligent, purposeful, gracious, loving being, right? With the existence of the universe. So if I skip that, trying to remove the need for God with the existence of the universe, in other words, with it being there, is equal to eliminating the creator of the internal combustion engine just because a good mechanic has learned how the engine works. The reality is there would be no engine without the creator of its existing and designing it. So if nobody made the engine, it's not there anyways. It doesn't matter. If you have a good mechanic and he says, hey, I know how this works, well, that doesn't eliminate the need for the guy that created it. The main point is this. If there was no such thing as an internal combustion engine, there would be no discussion as to how it worked. The understanding of it is possible only because it exists. Equally, any understanding of morality is only possible because God exists. If God did not exist, any understanding or talk of morality, even conceptually, would not exist. Since atheists understand morality, God is necessary. Otherwise, issues of morality, in other words, how the engine works, cannot exist to discuss. So let me see if I can break this down very simply. Using the analogy, the metaphor here of the engine. So somebody has to create the engine, and it doesn't matter how, in order for it to be there. And in order for the mechanic to understand the engine, he studies it. Now, he thinks about it, he discusses it, whatever he learns, right? So he becomes a good mechanic. Well, that doesn't eliminate the need for the creator of the engine. He wouldn't be working on anything. Now, he wouldn't even be discussing the engine and how it works if the person never created it. In other words, the engine has to exist in order for him to talk about it. If it didn't exist, right, we're not talking about somebody that's conceptually thinking of designing an engine. If the engine doesn't exist, nobody's going to talk about how the engine works. If God didn't exist and create the moral imperatives that are upon us, the obligation for right and wrong that we all sense, then we wouldn't be talking about morality, right? The reason that even atheists can know morality and sense morality and argue about it is because it exists, not because it doesn't exist. Now, because it exists, it has to come from someplace, and it comes from the transcendent being that we call God. All right? So I hope I'm making that clear. As we move on, the mind to understand the engine is given ontologically. I didn't create my own mind, if I'm a mechanic, to do that. It's not developed. I'm not some animal that just developed and figure out how an engine works. The skill is developed, but the mind is given, an important distinction, with its ability to analyze the engine, since it was a mind that created the engine in the first place. Because a mind created the engine, I can understand the engine because I have a mind. Because a mind created morality, right, I can understand morality because I have a mind. The problem with atheism is that in the midst of a moral universe, they are trying to figure out why they sense morality by avoiding the ontological necessity. It's too late. They live in God's universe. It's already there. It's after the fact. Atheists can study the engine of morality all they want. They will never be able to eliminate the one that created the engine, no matter how much they talk about morality or try to explain it through natural causes. Ironically, they use the reasoning ability God gave them to argue against his existence. And that is part of the dilemma. So in review, morality comes from a mind and can only be understood by a mind. Animals they can't comprehend this stuff. Animals don't have a mind like human beings, right? Morality is absolute and carries an obligation, a prescription, grounded in a transcendent referent, which is God's nature. It is not opinion person to person. We saw that. That is not morality. That's just preference or opinion. The engine metaphor. The engine requires a creator for it to exist, right? It doesn't get there on its own, and it comes from a mind. It is very detailed, but it is not even in the same galaxy of complexion, the complex aspects of an engine don't even compare to the human cell. So, now, morality requires a creator for it to exist, just like the engine does. Knowing the engine doesn't eliminate the need for its creator. Knowing morality doesn't eliminate the need for its creator. They logically follow. No one would know about or be discussing how an engine that doesn't exist works or study its details. No one would know about or be discussing the details morality unless it existed, and it does. And that's why we talk about it. The bottom line, the existence of morality requires God, therefore, no God, no morality. But we can't escape the reality of living in a moral universe, so we cannot escape God. He is there, he exists, regardless of whether you want him to or you don't want him to. In summary, morality, right and wrong, is sensed by all humans because it is written on their hearts by God. The Bible tells us that. And that answers the issue here, okay? And we have worked logically back to that. We didn't start there and come out. We're arguing to the inference to the best explanation, okay? What we all understand and experience universally. Morality is not from biology, which would be a preference. Biology reacts to stimuli. It does not think. It does not have the ability to think. It is reactionary. Morality is from God. It's an obligation. He is the moral lawgiver that determines right and wrong. Atheists cannot justify morality, but the problem is greater than justifying morality. In other words, why does it exist? The ontological issue has to be addressed and answered, which atheists do not address adequately. It doesn't even get close. Right and wrong requires obligation, not opinion. Therefore, morality transcends humanity. That's where God comes in. The fact that morality is understood requires God's existence. There would be no understanding of the concept of right and wrong without God. The engine example. It's very, very clear. Knowing morality epistemologically won't answer the question of why it exists, right? The ontological question. Only God's existence answers that question. So, that's the end of the presentation. I know it's a couple of minutes after an hour, but I appreciate you staying with me on that. I know there's a lot of thinking, and God's given you that ability to walk through this. But I hope you can see and understand that we wouldn't even be having this discussion about morality, this engine, unless somebody created it. And somebody created it that is transcending all of humanity, and that is God. Because if it was just a matter of biology from the ground up, there would be no aspect of absolutes, right, wrong, truth, non-truth. We wouldn't even be able to have this conversation. So please think through that. If you are an atheist, look, you need to answer the ontological issue. You just can't keep going around in the circle of epistemology and ignore the ontology of why morality exists in the first place and why you feel a moral obligation and why everybody does. So with that, if you're a Christian, hopefully, you understand a little bit more. And if you are a Christian, you can go into Romans 2. Paul the Apostle deals with this as an issue near the end of Romans 2. He talks about how God has given everybody a conscience. He's written laws on our hearts so that our conscience either accuses us or excuses us in what? In our behavior. It is transcending all of us. It comes from God, where the truth comes from. The truth is absolute. Morality is absolute. And the fact that we have morality proves that God exists. And if you follow the logic, it is inescapable. I hope that it's made some sense to you. You can always go back and re-examine the flow of thought. But until next time, May God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.